Okay. Hi everyone. So we're group 3 and we're going to be talking about the status of minorities in Bhutan. Next slide. Okay, so here's a brief outline of our presentation. So I'm going to give a Bhutan overview and the evolution of decentralization. And then we're going to talk about the Nepalese in Bhutan. Then Nate's going to talk about the Jiglam Namza. And then we'll move into the minority status in Bhutan and finally end off with the historical human rights. And so throughout our presentation, feel free to ask us questions in the chat if you want to contribute or if you have any questions, and let us know if you can't hear us or the video audio. Next slide. So to start off, here's a brief geographical overview of Bhutan. So it's a country in South Central Asia that is located on the eastern ridges of the Himalayas. And the mountains make up one of the most natural geographical figures of the country. So they play an important role in the lifestyle of the individuals in these regions. So at the top is the Great Himalayan Range, which is at the northern region. And up until the 1960s, there was a trading system between Bhutan and Tibet, which is found north of Bhutan. And the Bhutanese traded clothes, spices in return for grains, salt, wool, and herds of yak. And then in the mid-1900s, China overtook Tibet, which caused major changes to the lifestyle of those in this great Himalayan region. And it pretty much ended the isolation for Bhutan because there was no longer the trading system between the two countries. And then below that is the lower or the lesser Himalayas. And this is pretty much the economic core of Bhutan, mainly because the capital is found here, which is called Thimphu. So this area is fairly well populated and cultivated. And below that is the Duars Plain, which is mainly an area covered with thick vegetation and a large array of wild animals. And then small villages are found here at the foot of the mountains. Next slide. And so here's a bit about the Bhutan population. So Bhutan occupies an area of 40,000 kilometers squared, which is about 1/6 the size of Michigan, but it still has a multi-ethnic population of around 770,000 people. And so there are 3 main ethnic groups found in Bhutan. The first one is the Shanglas, which are the Aboriginal inhabitants of eastern Bhutan. And their common occupation is cultivation of wheat and vegetables, weaving and breeding of domestic animals. And then there are the Ngalaps, which are settled in western Bhutan, and they are of Tibetan origin, and their main occupation is agriculture and cultivation of cereals. And then the third main ethnic group is the Lahat Sampas, which are found at the southern foothills of Bhutan. And they migrated from Nepal in the beginning of the 19th century. So throughout our presentation, you might hear a little bit more information about this ethnic group. And they're mainly employed in agriculture and cultivation of cash crops. And there are a lot of other ethnicities, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. Next slide. So this is a timeline of Bhutan's independence. In 1947, India gained independence from Britain rule, which recognized Bhutan as an independent country. Then in 1949, India and Bhutan signed the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, which pretty much stated that India would not interfere with Bhutan's internal affairs, but would help guide its foreign policy. Then in 1952, Jigme Dorji Wangchuk became ruler, and Bhutan began to slowly emerge from its isolation that I stated before and begin a program of planned development. So as stated, Bhutan was in isolation up until like the mid-1900s, which was pretty much just trading amongst the Tibets and cultivation of crops and agriculture. But this new succession kind of created a new era for Bhutan. Next slide, please. So Jigme Dorji Wangchuk's rule lasted from 1952 to 1972. And during this time, ethnic problems began, but he had to work hard to assimilate the ethnic groups in order to prevent these problems. So these began to occur when the ethnic Nepalese, which were also known as the Lahat Sampas, began to organize themselves against the royal government of Bhutan. So they formed the Bhutan State Congress, and their main objective was to acquire rights and privileges of Bhutanese citizenship, as well as to change the discriminatory policy of royal government of Bhutan against the Nepali Bhutanese. So Jigme Dorji Wangchuk saw the need to integrate the Lahat Sampas into the mainstream of Bhutanese national life. And so he granted them representation in the Shagda, which is also known as the National Assembly, and he recruited them in the Bhutanese army and the civil service. Next slide. So Bhutan is a monarchy, which means that the sovereign power is vested in the king. Therefore, it needs a system to provide the oversight function and to review the conduct of government officials, which is known as the National Assembly or the Shagda. So this was established in 1953, and at that time it had a total of 150 members. 105 were elected by citizens, 10 were selected by the Buddhist clergy, and 35 were appointed by the king. Then in 1995, the king proposed an amendment to Bhutan's basic law that sets out that the procedures for the nomination and the election of the National Assembly members. This was adopted by the 73rd session of the National Assembly. And in order to be eligible for the nomination, there were specific regulations that were put in place, such as you had to be a citizen of Bhutan, you had to be at least 25 years of age, or be able to write in the Dongo language and speak different dialects, and a variety of other regulations. Then in 1969, the National Assembly was given the power to remove ministers appointed by the king, but this has never actually been done, mainly because the political authority resides ultimately in the king, and although major decisions are questioned by the National Assembly, they have never actually overturned any. Then in the June of 1998, the king introduced term limits to his council. So this proposed measures to increase the role of the National Assembly in the formation of the government. Then in July of 1998, a new council was elected into a 5-year term, and the elected assemblies were from local, district, and national levels. And the government did this to encourage decentralization and citizen participation.
Oh, hi. My name's Jing. I'm talking about the Nepalese in Bhutan. In 1950s, the ethnic problems occurs in Bhutan. Then in 1952, in South Bhutan, ethnic Nepalese against the discrimination of the Bhutan policy. And in 1970s, starting in the 19th century, the ethnic Nepalese began to migrating in Bhutan, setting the south part of the country. It's called the Lasmasa part of the Bhutanese. Because of the growing population of ethnic Nepalese, it's account of for the 1/5 of Bhutan's population. So the Bhutan's king and the majority government is worried about the growing populations could threaten the majority position and the traditional Buddhist culture of the Bhutanese. So they published the policy. The policy is about the one country and one people. The policies imposed the Bhutan dress code, religious practice, and the language used on all the planets regardless of the period of practice. Next, please. So here's the timeline of the nationality law of the Bhutan. In 1985, so the Bhutanese government reversed the nationality law of the 1958. The original law is talked about if you live in Bhutan for 10 years or more and owned agricultural land in Bhutan, you could have the Bhutanese citizenship. But in 1988, it changed the formal citizenship in Bhutanese and proposed that the premise of Bhutanese citizenship is that both parents are Bhutanese, and all children born between 1958 and 1988 whose mothers are non-Bhutanese must be declared illegal immigrants. It is also necessary for each family to show the relevant certificates of line tax. Families who cannot show the proof materials will also be regarded as the illegal immigrants. The introduction of the new bill directly caused nearly 125,000 ethnic Nepalese to lose their citizenship and become the illegal immigrants. Next, please. At the end of the 19th century, the immigrants from Nepal began to migrants to the lowlands of the South Bhutan. This is a temperate region. Although the farming is not perfect, the land is abundant. The Bhutan economy based on the agriculture. The main crops include the wheat, rice, orange, lemons, sugar cane, beans, pumpkins, soybeans, and especially lentils. The farm animals include the buffalo, cow, and the goat. Next slide, please. Under their language and the religious beliefs, the majority of Bhutanese refugees are bilingual. Most speak the Nepalese at home, but some also speak the Bhutanese language. Most 60% of the Bhutanese are hidden. 27 of they are Buddhist. 10% are the Kerot, and the remaining are Christian. So next slide, please.
I guess we can just go on to the next slide then. All right, yeah. So hi, I'm Nate. My part, we're going to be talking about Driglam Namza, specifically its implementation, the response to it from the native Nepali Bhutanese, and sort of the human rights violations that go along with it, and the overall outcomes of the laws. So it was in around the 1980s that the government of Bhutan started becoming extremely concerned with the influence of the native Nepali in the country, specifically their political influence as well as their cultural influence. As we've already talked about, one of the measures that the government did to try to, I guess, suppress this influence is by passing new nationality laws that retroactively deprive citizenship of a large number of the population. And part of the reason why the government was doing this is they feared specifically that that the long-term effects of the Nepalese culture on Bhutan would be extremely adverse and would destroy the cultural identity of Bhutan. That is specifically what they said their fear was. So in order to quell the cultural influence of the native Nepalese, the Bhutan government passed a set of laws known as Driglam Namza. And specifically what these laws are is they are extremely draconian cultural laws that force everyone in the country to adhere to the traditional cultural standards of the country, mainly in how they dress and the language that they speak. So they have to wear the traditional clothing, and the language of the country has to be taught in every school so that everyone knows it. And for some reason, I'm not sure if this is 100% true, they thought that this would help, bring the country together and to quell the cultural influence. But ultimately, this would end up causing the probably the greatest divide in the country's history and lead to so many human rights violations that it's just kind of crazy. So we can go on to the next slide. And part of the Drikulam Namsa that I find most interesting is the influence that the religion of Buddhism had on these laws. So I think we've already talked about this too. About 75% of the population of the country is Buddhist, specifically Drukpa Buddhist, and it's the country's national religion. And part of it, and because it's their national religion, the government sort of uh, props it up a lot more than the other countries. They promote it. That's the word I'm looking for. A lot more than the other religions in the state, and this comes largely at the expense of a lot of these other religions. So, how does this affect the culture of other people? Well, by sort of promoting Buddhism at the expense of all the other religions, they basically suppress the culture of those people. So, part of the ways that they do this is by their extremely strict religious laws. So, one of the religious laws that they have is that religious organizations within the country need to be passed by the Commission of Religious Organizations. They need to be registered with them in order to be an official religion. And in order for other religions to do this, that's for some reason it's extremely difficult for them. Right now, there are 97 registered organizations in Bhutan. And of the 97, there's exactly one umbrella Hindu organization, and the other 96 are all Buddhist. Another part of how they suppress other religions is that they have laws that require other religious institutions to get permits to build their religious buildings, like, temples and shrines for other religions. And this is basically impossible for other religious groups to do. The last time a non-Buddhist religious group got a temple or shrine built was all the way back in 2012. And then before that, the last one they were able to build was in 1990. So the Bhutan government tries very hard to keep these religions from really organizing, and as a result, kind of just suppresses their influence on the country as much as possible. And one of the other laws that they have that's pretty bad is that they require all non-Buddhists to observe prayer rituals and holidays in the Buddhist religion, even for non-believers, which you can imagine is not great. And then also non-Buddhist children, for some reason, just might not be able to attend school in the country. So they're denying education for people who don't follow their specific national religion. So we can go on to the next slide. So as you can imagine, the response to these laws from the Nepali Bhutanese was not great. They were understandably extremely upset about these laws. So how they responded is they started setting up their human rights organizations to protest against the government. One of these organizations was the Bhutan People's Party, or the BPP, which was set up by Tek Rizal in 1985 after he led protests against the laws and accused the government of human rights violations. He was later arrested in 1989 for anti-national and subversive activities. And then another human rights activist group that came to be in this era is the People's Forum for Human Rights, which was established by R.K. Budathaki in 1990. So we can go on to the next slide. So the BPP, what they did is they made a list of demands for the Buddhist government of the changes that they wanted. Primarily, their demands for the government were the release of all political prisoners, a change to a constitutional monarchy, proportional representation for all ethnic groups in the government, some judicial reform, to allow the Nepalese to preserve their cultural identity, so allow them to dress and speak and write the way that they have always done. They wanted more equitable distribution of wealth for all citizens in the nation, equal opportunity to employment, and the right to make political parties. And they wanted all this by August 31st of that year, so they only gave the government about 5 or 6 days to respond to it. And of course, the government declined these demands, they rejected them. And this caused a violent demonstration from the BBP, which would ultimately lead to a extremely brutal crackdown from the Bhutanese security force and start the refugee crisis of Bhutan. We can go on to the next slide. So how did these, what's the aftermath of all these laws? So 1991 marked the brutal and forced expulsion of lots of Nepali Bhutanese in the country. Many consider it to be essentially an ethnic cleansing. During this time, about 100,000 of the Nepali Bhutanese were forcibly removed from the country, which, if we remember from earlier in this presentation, there's about 800,000 people in the country. So that's like 1/7 or 1/8 of the entire population at the time, which is insane. Specifically, something that's interesting is that the leader of the BPP expelled at this time to a refugee camp in Nepal and was later murdered in 2001. And what happened to these refugees in the camps? Well, in 1993, Nepal and Bhutan began negotiations of how do we deal with all these refugees. It didn't really go anywhere. They created 4 categories of refugees, which were the Bhutanese who were forcibly evicted, Bhutanese who willingly emigrated to Nepal, non-Bhutanese who were expelled, and Bhutanese who committed crimes who were expelled. And upon creating these 4 categories of refugees, they didn't really create any sort of criteria or mechanism to determine what kind of refugee was what. So they didn't really get anything done during those negotiations. But the UN did a lot to help the situation. And over 10 years, they managed to resettle about 112,000 refugees from the country, a lot of them to the United States, which I thought was pretty interesting. And unfortunately, that program ended in 2018, and there's still thousands of refugees in those camps who are currently stateless. The government of Bhutan has also started releasing the political prisoners from these parties, although at a very slow rate. In 2016, there were still 57 people imprisoned, and Bhutan was adamant that all of the people still in prison were violent protesters. However, a lot of human rights activists would argue that about half of them should be considered political prisoners and be released. But the release of them has been at a rate of about 8 per year, which is extremely slow. And in Bhutan today, the Nepalis still face extreme discrimination. Many of them have been stripped of their citizenship and can no longer receive education or employment or housing. And they've also been barred from participating in the elections, both as voters and as representatives. So they basically have zero influence or say in anything that happens in the country. We can go on to the next slide. And then this is just a video clip showing the conditions of some of the refugee camps in Nepal from 1994.
For 5 generations.
My daughter is the 5th
Does it work?
generation born in
Yes,
Bhutan.
it does.
Like my great-grandmother was born in Bhutan. Then my grandmother who is in front of me, she was born in Bhutan. Then my mother, then myself and my daughter. I brought her when she was 1 month old. Now all of us, we are living in Timai refugee camp.
The camps of eastern Nepal are now home to 1 in 7 of the population of the tiny Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. 100,000 people have been forced out or have fled their country in fear.
Worst time was beginning of 1992 to mid of August, when 10,000 people per month were coming, and there were trucks and trucks of people coming from Bhutan. They were evicted.
Mangala and the others here are southern Bhutanese, Nepalese-speaking citizens of Bhutan. They're the victims of what appears to be a deliberate campaign by the Bhutanese government to wipe out its ethnic Nepalese community, which makes up almost half the country's population.
5 years ago, Bhutan was like a paradise for all of us, and everything was fine there. But say about 3 years from now, I don't know what happened. Bhutan government started evicting people, and out of
It began, Mangala says, with a census, which the government claimed was to identify illegal immigrants. But when they began evicting Bhutanese citizens, there was strong and sometimes violent opposition. It was then the authorities unleashed a campaign of terror against the ethnic Nepalese.
People were taken into custody, they were threatened, raped, young girls were raped, and many young boys were forced into forced labor. All the schools were closed, and all the schools were turned into local prisons, and hospitals were banned for the local people.
Like many men, Mangala's brother, formerly a village leader, tells of being imprisoned, beaten and tortured.
यहाँ भूमिमा खाना थुपारिदिन्छ तैँले यही खानु भनेर लेट्रिनभित्र लगेर 11 दिन राखेर साथमा दिनै पछि कुटो च्यापेर यस्तो उसको दुईजना आर्मीले यता पनि थिच्छ दुईटा काठ यसरी क्रप च्यापेर लो भन्नुहुन्छ उसले नभएको कुरो हो भन्न लाउँछ होइन भन्दा झन् साह्रो च्याप्छ अनि त्यसरी गरेर दिनै 7 महिनासम्म त्यहाँ मलाई त्यस्तो दुःख दिएर राख्यो र
Eventually he was freed, but only after his family and their entire village signed what the authorities called voluntary leaving certificates, stating that they would permanently leave Bhutan.
सबै आए छैन जुम्मै आए छैन हाम्रो गाउँमा त्यसै गरी नि यो घर खेदो अर्को घर खेदो अर्को घर खेदो कोही बासै बस्न पाएन घरमा सुत्ने पाएन बनबनै सुते भिर सुते खोलामा सुते पाखै सुते लोग्ने मान्छे जति त्यसो गरे आइनै केटाकेटी डरले आउँछ राति आउँछ दैलो गाड्छ अनि के गर्नु हाम्रो घर लडायो छैन अब मान्छेको सबैको लडायो नि अलि ठुल्ठुलो घर चाहिँ सबैको लडायो धन सम्पत्ति सबै लगो खुडी जुम्मै टाकटुकै लगो गाई वस्तु सबै यत्तिकै हिँडेका हामी यत्तिकै आँखा नदेख्दा राति भागेका लौरो टेप्दै कुद्या यो छैन केही पनि भएको छैन.
The story of Mangala Sharma's family is typical of the stories told by the 85,000 refugees. Everyone has harrowing tales to tell, but none of them can tell you why they're here, why they were forced out of Bhutan. And so we travelled to the remote and isolated mountain kingdom to try to find out why.
Okay, so for this side, there's a credible reports by the refugee and human rights groups that the security forces of Bhutan raped a large number of ethnic Nepalese women in the south part of area of Bhutan in 1991 and 1992. And according to the Amnesty International, some women were said to have died as a result. In another independent survey of 1,779 refugee families, there's about 26% of them cited rape, fear of rape, or threat of rape as a prime reason for their departure from the country. However, the government of Bhutan has denied those reports. Next slide. Actually, in 1953, rape was already made a criminal offense, but that law was weak penalties and was forced poorly. As I just mentioned in the previous slide, security forces raped a large number of ethnic Nepalese women. Therefore, in 1993, which is 1 year after that incident, the National Assembly adopted a revised Rape Act with a clear definition of criminal sexual assault and stronger penalties for that. In the case of rape involving minors like younger teenagers, sentences range from 5 to 17 years. In some extreme cases, a rapist may be imprisoned for the rest of life. Next slide.
Okay, so
in fact, there's a lot of non-governmental or human rights groups in Bhutan, but those groups are illegal in Bhutan. The reason for that is that the Bhutanese government regards those human rights groups as a political organization and does not permit them to operate in the country. I have listed the following 4 human rights groups in this slide: the Ethnic Nepalese Exiles, the Human Rights Organization of Bhutan, and the Human Forum for Human Rights in Bhutan. and the Association of Human Rights in Bhutan. There's actually a lot of more, but those four groups are basically the biggest groups in Bhutan. Next slide. The government of Bhutan committed to cultivate a national identity rooted in the language, religion, and cultural of Ngalip. And at the same time, the Bhutanese government constrained the cultural expression by other ethnic groups. From 1980s to early 1990s, the Bhutanese government expelled thousands of ethnic Nepalese from Bhutan due to the increasing political influences and population growth of those groups of people. In addition, female school enrollment has been growing up due to the government policies. Women constitute about 48% of total population and participate freely in the social and economic life of the country. There's about 43% of enrollment in school are females, and 16% of civil service employees are women. Women are increasingly found among senior officials, or private sector entrepreneurs, especially in tourism. Next, my partner Jin Kai is going to talk about the historical human rights and revolution of minorities. Go ahead.
Hi guys, I'm Xiu Junkai, and this is my historical human rights revolution of minorities slide. So basically, I'm talking about the details of all those real things happen in our life. So the Constitution of Bhutan was passed in 2008, and only then it did change from an absolute monarch. I have no idea what this word called, but anyways, it's from absolute monarch to a democratic thing. But essentially, it just changed the international declaration, but not actual actions. So Buddha itself has neither signed nor ratified many key international treaties addressing human rights. So although Bhutan's constitution was framed to reflect various basic human rights protected by the international conventions, Bhutan itself has neither signed or ratified all those things, which means many key international treaties addressing human rights that is not included by Bhutan. And so here's some information about when minority groups are not being minorities. So minority, this word means a culturally, ethnically, or racially distinct group that coexist with but is sorry. To a more dominant group. So as the term is used in social sciences, this subordinacy is the self-defining characteristic of a minority group. As such, minority status does not necessarily correlate to population. By the late 1980s, the Bhutanese government recognized 28% of the population as Lot Shamapa, although informal essentially were as high as 40% of those Nepalese, and only 15% of those Nepalese were estimated to be legal residents. Bhutan considered Nepal as excessively populated foreign nation and used this as an excuse to start a series of ethnic elimination program like Nate's video showed. And in the last 1980s, Bhutan's elite viewed the growing Nepal's population as a demographic and cultural threat. And then the government enacted discriminatory citizenship law against the Nepalese, depriving about 1/6 of their citizenship and paving the way for their deportation. And after that, here's the struggle of a hidden minority, which is the Nepalese. Here's a real story about how those Nepalese got threatened by those Bhutanese. So in the 1980s, the southern Bhutanese, which is the Nepalese actually, were seen as a threat to the country's political order. As a result, a new citizenship bill was passed, compelling Southerners, which is those Nepalese, to produce proof of citizenship. When public demonstrations were held to protest these legal restrictions, Southerners were imprisoned and tortured. Houses were demolished and human rights were almost non-existent. So here's the Boko Haram. It's actually very, I don't think it's holding 2,000 Nepalese people murdered in the Bagatam. It's actually happened in Nigeria, which is after those Nepalese got kicked by the Buddhisms, and then all those people went back to Nigeria, and on there, the human rights doesn't established by the public and or the government of Nigeria. So all those people are seen as foreign immigrators, but they're actually not. So basically, above 2,000 Nepalese got killed around the Boko Haram. If you search on the Wikipedia, this is like huge military army actions for local people. And then Nepalese increasingly after during the massacre, Nepalese are increasingly persecuting refugees who wish to accept the United States proposal through beating, burning, shit, and death threat, which means all those Nepalese, they think they have nowhere to live. And then after that, regarding every single help from the international people are threat. They want to murder them, but actually they're not. So after 70 years settlement, the elections in Bhutan considered with the resettlement for Bhutanese and Nepalese due to the United States force. And then all those refugees from the Nepalese that returning to Bhutan is the only acceptable solutions for the people on this world. And then Nepalese have to take these solutions, although they are afraid of either Nigeria or the United States or the Bhutanese itself. They have to take these terrible decisions to turn it back. And then that's all for the real story of the struggle of the hidden minorities. And then here's a reference of our resources. And then any questions? Thank you, guys. That